This workshop is presented by Brad Peterson. Brad is a landscape architect, educator, and land management consultant with over 26 years of experience in environmental design, ecosystem restoration, new urbanism, and permaculture design. Brad has worked on over 350 projects over his career for private clients, corporations, institutions, government organizations, and indigenous bands in rural and urban areas. He manages a polyculture orchard and a herb perennial vegetable production systems on his farm near Chatsworth, Ontario.
Thank you. Thanks for being here, everyone. I'm Brad Peterson, and we're going to talk this afternoon about a permaculture pattern language. While we're saying thanks, I think that we should also recognize Thomas for his 37th year running the Guelph Organic Conference. And I just want to check, first of all, can you hear? Is everyone able to hear? So we need to thank Thomas and his team. We can thank Alex for his technical help in setting this up. And of course, we need to thank Stefan Dabrowski of Albedo Video Productions for his assistance in recording today. And of course, we need to thank all of you for having an interest in a pattern language. I'm always amazed how many people listen to TED Talks. So isn't it amazing that somebody can stand up at the front of a room and in just 17 minutes tell you their entire life history of the work that they're doing, and they can encapsulate everything that they're presenting in just 17 minutes. So I was thinking today we could do one of those and everybody could go home early. Would that be all right? No, there's a no back there. Somebody said, oh, but this is supposed to be an hour and a half. So I decided to divide the this presentation up into 5 TED Talks, or what I call TED Bites, which is the equivalent of 17 minutes of talking while it's being recorded. So let's start at the beginning. We're going to start with pattern language. You'll see that PL is short for pattern language. So permaculture, this definition was from Wiki, but I decided to change it because it said something about self-maintaining agricultural systems. And while that's a goal in permaculture, it's certainly not a reality. So I'd rather have my definitions reflect reality. So we'll just call these agricultural systems modeled on natural ecosystems. And permaculture, of course, is completely unregulated. It's just an area of inquiry that's caught on over the last 60 years, and people are very interested in it around the globe. And so it's had a lot to contribute to humanity over that time, and it continues to. What's interesting is that it remains unregulated, but because it has so much to offer, and it has so many good ideas, but it's not really organized yet. So I thought, well, why not present these ideas in somewhat of an organized way? Probably the best way is in a pattern language, because anyone who picks up on the patterns can interpret them in their own way, so that there's an infinite number of possibilities in terms of interpretation and in coordinating the different patterns that are assembled to do a project. So a pattern language then, you can read that, was initially developed by Christopher Alexander, and in terms of the built environment, and it really works with what we call patterns. We'll be talking a lot about those. Essentially what a pattern language helps us do is express the aliveness, the kind of innate aliveness and potential of a project. And what is this aliveness? What are we kind of aiming for in all of this work? He also calls it the quality that has no name. sort of like the core of the essence of something that's alive. It's sort of mystical, it's magical, and you can never really quite get there because it belongs to the infinite. And so that's where we want to go in terms of developing our patterns. You know you have a good pattern the close it gets to that quality without a name. And that's what I think keeps the pattern language alive itself. All right, so here's the volume 2 of the pattern language set. The first volume is the timeless way of building. And if you're interested in pattern language, this is certainly prerequisite, necessary reading. What's interesting about Christopher Alexander is that it took him about 20 years to put these volumes together, and about 20 people a year. So that's about 400 person years that went into this. And he is known as an architect, but he was also a mathematician and a physicist before he became an architect. And so he brings a lot of discipline to this study. But it almost focuses entirely on the built environment. So he looked at towns, regions in which towns were organized, communities, neighborhoods, clusters of buildings, the streets, the spaces between buildings. So it was all about the built environment. And so we think then that while this was a magnificent work, it really didn't draw very much on the environment and how to live in an environmental age, and as we move forward into an environmental age. So this is what drew some interest then in creating a pattern language for today, stemming from Christopher Alexander's work. So essentially what's driving this interest then is to organize a pattern language for today's needs, and not to intrude into Christopher Alexander's work, but to stand beside it, sort of as a sister pattern language. The idea also is to use the internet so that the development of this pattern language could be available for everyone to participate. Sort of like Wiki is available for anyone to add their expertise into. It would be interesting to offer this through the internet so that people could add their own patterns. So as we get into this language, we have to start with some sort of groupings of topics. So essentially then, the topics that we're willing to work with are those that Holmgren reminds us of in permaculture, which is land care, people care, and fair share. And so I've listed some of the major categories within those three here. And you'll often find these categories in other sorts of environmental design systems. So this really isn't much new, except we are sort of evolving into the blue headings now. So we're beginning to recognize the value of indigenous peoples, and we're recognizing social organization, and this lovely pattern that I'd like to speak more on, cultural emergence, which is sort of the evolution of our culture from the post-industrial age and the age of dualism into the age of potential, into the age of recognizing that we have to live within our limits in the global environment, and what that means in terms of culture. And of course, fair share is associated with economics. So in order to set the scope for this endeavor, there were some decisions that had to be made. we thought that should we stay strictly within permaculture, sort of just within the permaculture literature and sort of just work with that? Or should we sort of spread out a little bit and see what sort of patterns, what sort of principles are shared within the larger environmental design community? Or indeed, should we just open up the floodgates entirely, and should we just accept all environmental design systems and make a grand sustainability pattern language? Well, it's a big enough endeavor just to do permaculture. So we decided then that we should stay within permaculture, but to admit other imported related principles and patterns that are related with permaculture to the other environmental design systems and how other environmental design systems influence permaculture. So we're willing to go kind of blur the boundaries a little bit, but basically stay within permaculture. So just to compare, we could take, I forgot to mention that we will be taking a break and taking questions at the end, unless the questions are very brief.
When you're saying permaculture, are you including humans' habitation?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we're including the built environment, but we don't want to duplicate what Alexander has done.
Okay, I just wasn't sure what
Yeah.
your definition for permaculture.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it has to include,
Culture or
yeah, it includes both. And that involves necessarily the built environment. So to compare the two and to see how we're sort of evolving from one to the other, we can look at some of these. If we look at, let's say, housing clusters and work communities, that's definitely a solid pattern in Christopher Alexander's work. On the other side, though, we're beginning to look at new urbanism and the usefulness of eco-villages. So we're kind of bringing an environmental focus to things like housing clusters and calling those eco-villages. Down here, we're looking at housing clusters and communities of common land. And so that's great. We have common land there and the common use of land. Environmentally, we can be looking at local food, fiber, and fuel production. So that's definitely an environmental focus. Local shops and gathering places. We can also then start to look at community farms and farmers' markets. So this is starting to tell us a bit more about how we can interpret these old patterns in an environmental way and come up with new patterns. Building inside and outside the edge interface. We're also looking at the interface and with things like solar orientation, because Christopher Alexander doesn't really associate too much with things like solar orientation. So that's how we're sort of moving, sort of evolving out of Christopher Alexander's work. I also want to spend a little bit more time than comparing the patterns from one language to another. Alexander talks about site repair, but in that context, site repair is just not building on green fields if you have the option to build on a brown field. So he's saying, don't build in a beautiful place, save that beautiful place for later, and just build in a place that's already been disturbed. But now when we talk about site repair, we have to actually step back, like all the way to a global level. So we can talk about global repair and regional repair, and even subdivision repair. Existing subdivisions can be redesigned into more sustainable communities. So that's a form of site repair that's definitely new and interesting. and minimal site disturbance. So we're just saying, if you're going to develop a new site, keep the topsoil, look at the drainage, kind of work with the drainage of the site without changing it too much. Keep the site alive, keep it breathing, basically. And disturb it as least as possible. He does have compost. His idea of compost, of course, is with human recycling of wastes, human manure. And that's as far as he gets into compost. Well, naturally, we can look at compost in terms of nutrient recycling with all the nutrient substances we're in touch with, and recycle garden compost. And we can add mulch to that pattern as well. Farmhouse kitchen, he talks about the size of a kitchen being large enough to have a big group of people around and have a heavy table. And that's really important. We're looking at that now in terms of family table. What does that mean in terms of having a family table in the environmental age? And how does that bring other people together in an extended family? So we're kind of bringing in the social organization aspect into these patterns as well. This is an example. These are just examples of how we're kind of evolving out of Christopher Alexander's work. And a couple more, because we wanted to look at this. Efficient structure. When he talks about efficient, he's talking about how to make the largest building with the least amount of material. And so that's kind of material efficiency. But of course today, efficiency means energy efficiency. So he's talking about green buildings, and we're talking about green buildings now, and how to make them the most energy efficient. So that must be an emerging pattern in today's world that wasn't so important in Christopher Alexander's time. And you can read through these. He has another one called fruit trees, and that's just a great idea for having fruit trees outside your door, basically in the neighborhood somewhere. But we can develop more extensive patterns around fruit production than that, in terms of polyculture orchards, in terms of community orchards, and growing a lot of different plant materials in the same place, with an orchard, with the orchard being the dominant structure. He does mention greenhouses, but there's many other types of greenhouses that aren't mentioned in that language. So we can talk about season extension and bioshelters, and sort of indoor-outdoor rooms and solariums and all those things that haven't been mentioned yet. So I hope this gives you an idea about if there's a need to move from one language to another. So that ends our first TED Bite on rationale and scope. Alrighty, so we're going to then start what patterns are and the structure of the language. So this is a graphic depiction of a pattern language, with the dots being patterns, and you can see that they're kind of organized loosely in tiers. Some vary at the top, some vary at the bottom, according to the scale at which that pattern affects that design, and how that design can be related to higher patterns. So best by an example, let's say a house, a single dwelling might be part of a cluster of houses, might be part of a neighborhood, might be part of a municipality, might be part of a global community. And you can see that the connections between the patterns are just as important as the patterns themselves. And essentially, they're all connected in a web. So you should be able to take one pattern and relate that to others of its similar variety, but those then are related to other types of diverse approaches and considerations for that entire project. So the patterns form a whole network. Remember that whatever we do with those patterns, they're always hearkening back to, you should be able to trace them back to one of our topics here. I just wanted to throw that in again. Or another way to look at the pattern language is to consider it like a cloud of dots, each dot being a pattern. And so you're in this three-dimensional shape, and it's sort of tiered. At the top, you've got larger scale patterns having to do with regions and neighborhoods. In the middle, you've got communities, building clusters, and at the bottom, you have individual buildings, and all the way down to details, like windows and doors. And so then it's all beginning to form a cohesive expression. And then these are connected, as they were in that first graphic, up and down, across, through, and sideways. So out of Christopher Alexander then, if we look at how these patterns are related to each other, under neighborhood, for example, you can have these particular patterns. And they can vary from cars to people to boundaries to common land to built environment, so that these patterns all have something to say according to the timeless way of building, to reach that quality without a name. So that the more patterns you have that are alive, that you're expressing, the more alive that project will be. And the more it will become a part of nature and be timeless itself. However, it's also important to realize that the pattern language is not static, and its patterns will change from age to age, from culture to culture, because each person, when they do a project, is interpreting those patterns in their own way. And that's the magic of a pattern language. It will never be static. You can never say, this is the only way to do this thing. It can always be interpreted in a million different ways. But still, we want to aim for that quality without a name. All right, so this was a brief one. This is the end of the second TED Bite. All righty. And we're actually going to take a very quick early break. How many people have read pattern language? Part thereof? Okay. So you've got a lot of reading ahead of you, because these are like 400, 500 pages. And there were 253 patterns that he determined in all different kinds of categories. And so far we found about 160 for permaculture. All right, so welcome back to the third session. This is looking right inside the cluster of dots. Next. So this is where we're going to go. And each of those are going to be named now. So, are not each of them, just a few examples of some of those. So if we talk about green neighborhood as sort of a middle pattern between patterns that are larger than that, so if we look at municipal permaculture and all the different categories that municipal permaculture can be expressed in, and one of those is green neighborhood. And then within green neighborhood, we can talk about all these other patterns. They can be expressed in different ways. So if you want to build a green neighborhood, you go through the pattern language and you select out the patterns that you think will be best for that green neighborhood. So here's some examples. There's water cascade, microclimates, local co-ops, green buildings, educational renewal, because we want to reorganize our educational system, local food, fiber, and fuel, and so on. So, and this is just an example. Normally we'd have maybe 2 or 3 dozen patterns in order to begin to express what should be made and coordinated together in a project. So if we look at what green neighborhoods could look like then, we just need to add some more visuals here. Here's an example of 50 acres of an eco-village. So there's a lot of different patterns assembled here in different ways. There's streets, there's neighborhoods, there's a garden farm, there's live, work, and sort of retail commercial areas, there's service areas, there's management of stormwater in what we call water cascade now, and livable streets, and so forth. Different kinds of housing, so there's a whole mix of housing. Some of these patterns are actually from Christopher Alexander's work. Others, like local food production in this microfarm, are certainly from a permaculture pattern language. So we're beginning to be able to mix these languages together. I just love this lower one. This is what we call a pocket neighborhood. Probably pocket neighborhood should be a pattern where you've taken down the fences or you just soften the lot lines at the back and have common land behind the houses. So we begin to have a garden, an orchard, we could have a workshop, we could have a campfire circle, and then access pathways through the whole rear yard, which is all geared to improve the quality of life for people in that neighborhood. They can begin to understand what safety is with each other. They can supervise the whole area. They can gather there. Children can go and play there. You can have young and old people commuting together, and a lot less grass to mow. So, and it can be productive. It can be, growing local food and fulfilling some sort of service function within this area. And this is what we're looking for in terms of the design of new green neighborhoods. And it doesn't have to be in a suburban environment. It can be in an urban environment. This is a sort of street design called a woonerf. How many people have heard of woonerf? It's from the Netherlands. It's a design approach from the Netherlands to make streets less car dependent and more pedestrian friendly. And so we put in psychological and physical barriers to cars, green them. It becomes more of an outdoor shopping area, more of a communal area, so that the streets actually become more pedestrian. And this is certainly a viable pattern within permaculture. I love this one where you can grow your food and order your food in a restaurant right across the sidewalk. Basically, as we know, a lot of permaculture comes down to growing food, and so we want to make every opportunity there is to do that. If we take local food, fiber, and fuel and see what sort of patterns emerge from that, there's many different ways of growing local food, fiber, and fuel. You can do it individually yourself. You can do it as a group. You can hire somebody to run a microfarm. You can have farmers markets that bring in food from nearby. So there's many different patterns that fit in local food, fiber, and fuel. And what does that look like? Well, we all know what farmers markets look like. We can begin to have livestock in the city within reason. Certainly, we can have chickens in our backyards in more and more municipalities now. And our backyards themselves can be permaculture yards. And that is another pattern that's emerging. Is this sort of relaxed, semi-natural, and whatever your vision is for your property, you can be growing food, or you can be creating habitat, or just a place to read books in the summertime. Maybe you could be reading the pattern language in these landscapes. And certainly actually outright growing food and hiring a farmer that specializes in intensive agriculture right in the city. Let's take a look at green buildings. So these are some of the patterns associated with green buildings. We're looking at pantries and kind of designing our spaces in houses to fit with the evolving environmental movement. So we can look at pantries now. Certainly renewable energy is part of the house construction usually. We can look at kitchen gardens, laundry lines. We definitely have to look at solar orientation. So this is just some of the patterns that emerge from looking at green buildings. And what does that look like? So there's definitely a larder. Does anyone recognize this landscape? Home Alive at Everdale. That's right. And this landscape is nicely maturing now. That was in 2003, so that was 15 years ago. It was implemented about 14 years ago. So that's a 14-year-old permaculture yard that's producing herbs, perennial vegetables, annual vegetables, fruits, nuts, berries, everything. This is a summer kitchen. Of course, not everyone needs that sort of elaborate summer kitchen, but it's the idea of being outdoors, of kind of living more outdoors. And if you're going to be processing food or making something that would heat up the house unnecessarily, you can do that outdoors now. And that becomes part of your indoor-outdoor living space, which is definitely part of a new pattern. Maybe it's not a new pattern. We probably had that a long time ago, but we're rediscovering it. And that's a bioshelter. So bioshelters are essentially super insulated greenhouses. That's a standalone structure. That can be part of a building. So you have a building facade up here, and that could be internal within the facade of a south-facing building. There's many different ways of expressing this. Food preserving. So how many people are getting into preserving foods, fermenting foods, canning? You know, like a lot of people are doing that. So let's have our architecture reflect that. And drying foods, actually, here's a tiny little pantry, doesn't take up much room. That can be part of house design now. And so that should be part of a new pattern for green buildings. Green household. So we're kind of moving into the social cultural, kind of the new expression of social cultural. Neighbor's path is an interesting little definition of what living in the environmental age is. And the answer is, does anyone know the answer? Well-worn paths to our neighbors. That's sort of one indicator of living sustainably. I'll get into the family table in a minute. Living in the garden, that's sort of that outdoor living that's important. And shifting enterprise. I'll get into that in a second. So family table is an interesting pattern. It just doesn't mean gathering your family around you in the living room. It means actually accepting other people into your family, sort of accepting the idea of extended family. In other words, drawing your circle wide and bringing those who are alone or in need or whatever their association might be. We're kind of thinking globally in terms of almost a global culture, a global family. And so that's an interesting pattern to think about. Emerging enterprises. So enterprises that contribute to the green economy. And so have a meaning at the end of the day in terms of living sustainably. That can be part of a green household. And I actually put in some grafting, an image of grafting fruit trees, experimentation, sort of doing things, finding out what new varieties of fruit trees there might be or whatever, contributing to that within the larger community that's working on that. Be part of a green household. And of course, thinking of more than just humans, thinking of what else we're reliant on. The whole biology, what we do on a farm as also part of a greater household, a greater environmental household that we are dependent on. And so we're just admitting the fact that we're living in a council of all beings, and they can be part of our household. Water cascade. This is an interesting one because its actual place is probably way up at the top, because water cascade means it can be expressed in so many ways. It's basically taking water at the highest elevation and making the best use of it as it moves through the landscape until it finally gets infiltrated into the ground or taken out by a perennial river course of some kind or a lake. So we're kind of capturing that water and making the best use of it rather than just letting it dump right out. So these are all different patterns associated with that. Rain pond. I like the idea of a natural swimming pond or a little natural swimming a plunge pool. Solar showers, enhanced infiltration. In fact, you can use micro swales to drain water to help you irrigate your gardens. And so that's all part of water cascade. And that's what this is beginning to look like. This is a rain garden or a swale in the city. This is a technology for biofiltering human waste and recovering the nutrients and using those and recycling those nutrients in a safe way in our food producing systems. This is for growing fish in a greenhouse. And of course, does anyone know who this gentleman is? P.A. Yeomans. Who said that? Yes. And so this is a picture of P.A. Yeomans standing beside his keyline irrigation swale. And this has to be from Australia, demonstrating where he is putting his flags for water to fill up in here until it overflows and floods the area down elevation from that swale. And then when that's irrigated, he lifts up the flag and goes to the next one and lets that fill up and overflow. And then he goes to the next one, lets that fill up and overflow. And that's how he irrigates land in a very cost-effective way. And so that's influenced everything we're talking about in terms of keyline these days. And so it's just basically an efficient way, and it's part of the water cascade that we're making the best use of water as it moves through the landscape. And of course, we can incorporate these ideas into green neighborhoods. And that is it for our third section on examples of patterns. I want to take you through some of the decisions that we're making to try to make this pattern language come together. We already have spoken about relatedness, how there's similarity in patterns that are related to the pattern above it. So for example, for water cascade, we can be talking about all these other patterns that are associated with water cascade. In terms of season extension, there's many ways of extending the season. But some of these patterns, or potential patterns, are just a single use, something like low tunnels, or something like perhaps row covers. So is that enough of a use for it to qualify as a pattern? Or is it just an example of how to extend the season, and you can just use these as examples by explaining, let's say, the season extension pattern. So you have a decision to make: how far into detail do you want to go, or how far into single use do you want to go? Some of these patterns, like bioshelter or sun trap, can be used for a lot of other things than extending the season. So maybe that qualifies for it enough to stand alone as a pattern. Okay? So you've got some decisions to make in terms of what's in and what's out. Growing local food, all of these patterns, it seems all of these patterns are multi-use. So they can probably all qualify as being patterns that stand on their own. So then we have to go through the language and select which patterns can contribute and be involved in making in solving a design problem for one particular project. So the ones we saw before were functionally related. This is sort of operationally related in terms of creating a cluster of patterns that can be used in a project. So these aren't related in terms of similarity of function. These are related in terms of what they contribute to the whole. Okay? And you can read through these. For small farms, we can have ponds, alley crops, catch crops, rotational grazing, poultry tractor, key line cultivation. We can have polyculture orchards. We can have living outdoors in the garden. All those sorts of patterns can contribute to adding aliveness and the quality without a name to the projects they're worked on. And so that's where we want to go with all of this. We want to have this available to everyone. There are some naming protocols. We tend to name patterns as a noun, and we tend to name them in the singular. So that, let's say, for example, if we had composting, compost bin, or compost, which one would you choose? Compost. So, personally, you can choose whichever one you want. You can create your own language. Personally, I would choose compost because it's singular, it's a noun, but it also can kind of harken back to a verb of some kind, an activity of some kind. You know, I'm going to compost now. So we tend to use compost. For farm retail, farm gate, or farm gate sales, which one would you use? Any ideas? You can't be too wrong because there's only 3 to choose from.
You can't be wrong at all. They're all applicable.
They're all?
They're all applicable.
They're all applicable, right? So we have to have one taker on one.
I'm doing farm gate sales.
Farm gate sales?
Yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Okay, well, you can have farm gate sales. I'm not saying you can't have them.
That's an activity.
It's an activity. Um,
But I want it to be an activity, don't I?
That's right. That's right. You want it to mean an activity. You want it to mean actually an event. It's actually an event. But we're calling them nouns. I don't know. It's just the protocol that's been used before. That can change. So anyway, I kind of like farm retail because it includes farm gate. And it includes bulk sales to the distributor. And it includes a market garden. Unless farm gate, unless you can legitimize farm gate and draw that out and make enough of a compelling argument for it to be a pattern. So I'm not saying we can't have it. You just have to legitimize. You have to have a legitimate reason for it.
Farm sales is not there.
Farm sales?
Retail.
Farm sales, actually farm sales would be better because it includes wholesale. So that's great, farm sales. Somebody make a note of that. Okay, all right, so we want to keep it short and descriptive. I just want to go through how Christopher Alexander organized presenting his patterns. It's actually been referred to since as the Alexandrian format. And so this little sort of cascade of how he presented it is how each pattern is presented in that book. So it starts with a heading and a rating. He actually rates these with an asterisk. And so it's sort of a subjective rating, but he's telling you right off the bat how close that he has come, what he feels he has come to the archetype, to the invariant, what he calls the invariant. And if you get two asterisks, you're as close as you can get to coming to the invariant. If you get one, it means that you've captured probably some of those qualities. You've got a little bit more to do, though, to actually make it a true invariant. And if you don't get any, it means that you're compelled to include it somehow, but there's a lot more work to do in terms of finding that quality without a name, or expressing that quality when that pattern is implemented. Then there's a photo, then there's paragraphs, and essentially what he does is state the problem. What compelled you to include this pattern? What was the problem there was initially that made you think of this pattern? And then you essentially describe what the solution is, what that pattern is giving you in the long term. And so this is what, these are 4 pages photocopied out of the book from pattern 171, which is called Tree Places. So then he's starting with the heading. This one has 2 asterisks, and with a photo, and then there's 3 diamonds. Oh, pardon me, there's an introductory paragraph and an end paragraph. So the introductory paragraph just in one sentence describes that pattern and makes a reference to all the other patterns above it in the language, so that you can go back to those patterns and see what they were about and why this pattern fits within that in its sort of functional relationship. And at the end, he relates this pattern to all the other patterns below it or beside it, so that you can see what it's related to. And in between is the problem statement and the solution, and some descriptions there, and usually a little diagram. So he was British, of course, and this is a very sort of prose-like way of expressing those patterns. And it's sort of relaxed, but it's disciplined. and people have taken this on to express their patterns in other languages. All right, so did we finish that section? Yes. Yes, we did. All right, so that was our fourth TED Bite, ladies and gentlemen. We're on to findings. Just want to tell you how far we've gotten. You probably can gather that we're going to accept permaculture and its influences back and forth with other environmental design systems to a point. We're going to talk about trends, and so how, if there's trends in these new patterns that are emerging. We've listed about 160 initial patterns. There could be more or less in any sort of final working version that will be released onto the internet. And there's a lot more work to do. In other words, we've just kind of begun this process. So basically, what have we found in terms of sort of trends beyond Christopher Alexander and into an emerging permaculture pattern language? Well, obviously, some sort of emphasis on the environment is absolutely necessary and indicative of this new language. We're finding that there's some social, cultural, and economic patterns that are emerging as well, so that it becomes a necessary part of us living sustainably. So the economic patterns, for example, exchange systems, basically bartering. Is bartering a pattern? Or, should we consider it alternative exchange systems, non-monetary exchange systems, or Bitcoin or whatever, as a new emerging pattern? Does it add aliveness to the whole system? Does it increase our ability to be sustainable? So you can sort of begin to answer those. And so we have to ask all these questions through this process. We have found action-related patterns, so not just so much physical things, but things like carbon storage and sequestration. So we're trying to keep it as sort of a noun, as much as we can as a noun, but it really implies an activity. So there tends to be this trend toward action-related patterns to increase our environmental awareness and the quality of the environment that we find ourselves living in. And there's also this percolation upwards, where we're finding patterns, let's say water cascade, that's actually connected to water cascade at a higher scale, and that's connected at a higher scale and a higher scale. So there seems to be this percolation upwards of patterns as we admit of an environmental sort of protocol. And ultimately, we're working toward a global solution environmentally. So something like municipal permaculture, something that we haven't thought of much in the past. We thought of permaculture at the site scale, and maybe the community scale at best. We can think of permaculture being expressed at across a city or across a region. And we believe this should be an important emerging pattern.
Is that referencing the transition town?
Transition towns is a great example of percolation upwards. Yeah, exactly. So what really is it about patterns? These magic little sort of electrons that are bouncing around all over and are connecting, and they disappear and reappear somewhere else in a slightly different form. Patterns actually are deeply rooted in feeling. And they actually arise from this quality without a name, this sort of creative essence of things that occurs as an event in space. And so if you want to look at the kind of the genesis of a pattern, where it actually comes from, it actually comes from an event that we participate in. And it's through these repeated events over and over again that gets expressed in slightly different ways, but we begin to recognize that reoccurrence of that type of event, and that can be expressed as a pattern. So try to think of it if you're creating new patterns that way. The other thing is that it's an organic process we're trying to capture. In other words, it's never the same. It's continually evolving. The pattern language continues to evolve. So you're not adding patterns like bricks in a wall. Like we'll add this one, we'll add this one. They're actually so related to each other that they kind of grow out of each other. So the way an embryo grows, all of a sudden it differentiates into another group of cells here, or it differentiates into another group of cells there, and continues to increase its diversity, its representative diversity. That's sort of how the patterns grow out within the language. So it's a very organic evolution to the language as a whole. And another interesting thing is to ask ourselves, does the pattern contribute to the solution to the degree where it can free it of inner contradictions, to free the result you're aiming for, the end product, free of inner contradictions or competing forces. So it's another really interesting way to try to get at the purity, I hope, what a pattern can be. So as we build patterns, who do we refer to? Do we stand on the shoulders of giants, of those who have gone before us, and check their work to see if there's patterns in their work that can be brought into this growing body of patterns? Very likely, that would be a good thing to do. We want to know what they were thinking and if they're included. And who else do we check along that route?
You look at what people are actually doing.
Pardon?
You look at what people are actually doing.
What they actually presented to us. And what they're doing, sure what they have done, absolutely. Sepp Holzer is definitely a doer. So is he saying something that we should be cognizant of it and include? So for testing, we've talked about testing already. Does it bring aliveness and generate life as part of the solution? Does it resolve inner forces and contradictions? Does it belong to some sort of ageless character and contribute to the whole? It's got to contribute to the whole somehow. And can it be included in a cluster of other working patterns and not be diluted? Can it still work within its working cluster? And I love this one. Can it raise the level of morality of a thing? Another way to check. Can it raise the morality of a thing so that it can become actually an expression of nature? In other words, permanent. Part of a permanent culture. And it may be in different areas of the planet. Okay? And so we need to figure out who will do this testing. Well, if you're creating your own project or your own patterns, then you can test it, or you can ask somebody else to test them. If we're going to have this pattern language available on the internet, then there has to be some sort of testing before we can release that language. So we need to cross-check, we need to test, We need to write the patterns, and we need to try to see if we can post this on the internet for everyone to use. Then, of course, wouldn't there have to be also some checking? Because somebody could offer a rogue entry that wouldn't apply at all. I suppose Wiki is tested as well. It's reviewed by reviewers to see if the new additions into the Wiki world are legitimate and worthwhile. That's why you often see, you know, provide a reference here. Is this really correct to say? So there would have to be that sort of checking as well. And so who will do that? So basically, if there's a group of people that are interested in working on this, perhaps we can move this whole endeavor forward and offer it actually for everyone to use someday. But that would be quite an undertaking, but if it's necessary to do, I think a group of people will come together for that. And of course, this is for everyone. The idea is to make this available for everyone, to lend legitimacy to permaculture, and for it to be available for everyone as a sort of a consensus tool that we can use. And of course, we want this available for the professions as well. Alrighty, so this is where we're going. Good luck. Thank you. I just want to remind you that I do consulting, and I'm interested in permaculture in all of my work, and include it certainly in one way or another in many different types of projects. So that ends our 5th and last TED Bite for today. All right. All right. Thanks so much. And thanks for being patient and sticking with the presentation today. Are there any questions?
I was wondering what it was a graph that had like a bunch of pink lines and dots on it, what that was visualizing, what data that was about, or maybe it was just an example of how patterns relate to each other.
Yeah. That color diagram with the colored dots and how they were all in a network.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just a graphic depiction of what a pattern language looks like. So each dot in that was represented as a pattern. And so the lines that connected them were how those patterns connect or relate to each other.
Okay. Was this one of Christopher Alexander's?
I think it could have been one of his hand sketches, because it's what I found when I was looking for images of pattern language,
Okay.
and it came up, and it looked like a really interesting depiction.
In order for something to be included in this template for pattern language, because you were discussing how to decide if something was just an example or whether it was actually part of the pattern language.
Right.
The pattern language, I imagine that you're trying to come up with is something that would be globally useful.
Yes.
So I guess then the criteria to make sense would have to be not an example that's a local example, but a pattern that's globally useful.
Well, it could be both, because it has to relate to the real world.
Yeah, like for
It
instance,
has to come out of the real world somewhere.
one of the examples was something about a sun, so that it was more applicable to a northern climate.
Right.
In a desert
Right.
climate, you're not going to want to do that.
Yeah.
Right, so then it's just an example, it's not part of the useful global.
Right. Okay. So the decision you're making, you see, the decision you're making is how relevant will it be to everyone. So sun trap will be relevant to some people. And so if you're living in a desert and you're selecting patterns, you don't have to select sun trap. Just go on to whatever will be useful for you.
Thinking out Alexander's book, his patterns were all pretty much globally used.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So we're in an environmental context now that's related to the globe. So we have to be, I think we need to be a bit more relaxed about it there, because we want this available to everybody. Yeah. So there's a bit of a dilemma, but it comes down to your personal decisions on what you're going to accept into your project or not. So you can just make that decision. Yes.
I always got the impression that the pattern language is a work in progress,
Yes.
not a settled piece where it's like done.
Yeah, it is.
So-
He never intended it to be static or for it to ever end. It was never intended to come to
Patterns don't
completion.
end by nature.
That's right. Patterns just keep going.
Yeah, so.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
to me, to have that rigidity of like, oh, this is supposed to work in every context across all time periods, that doesn't make much sense.
No,
But it has to be examined before it can be projected.
Yeah.
but you have to test it in the real world to see if it's actually working, if it works. And we'll get to testing in just a minute, because I do have a testing page. Yeah.
I just want to ask, is there within the language something that you see as sort of a flag system where, say you're using pattern language to examine the tobacco industry or the marketing and sales of bottled water? Is there something where you can see in that where there is a disconnect to other surrounding patterns, and that therefore lets you know that this is not a sustainable practice?
It's not fun.
Right.
So what would you call that pattern?
Dysfunctional, yeah.
It's an interesting concept.
But those are obvious ones that we now know. But what if you're looking at the potential oversaturation of marijuana, which I think we're going to experience in the next 5 years? There's already enough of it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But we don't know that. Can we use the pattern language to predict these things? But things seems like a good idea.
Well,
down the line.
In The Timeless Way of Building, the first volume, he talks about dead patterns, and that you don't choose dead patterns because they don't contribute to the aliveness.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
yeah, so you accept a pattern as a legitimate pattern when it contributes to aliveness. And if it doesn't, it could be a dead pattern.
And therefore, that's a very useful skill to warn us.
Well,
we've
yeah.
gotten into things as a society before where
Yeah.
it seemed like a good idea
Yeah.
at the time. And then
He doesn't list dead patterns. He gives examples of them in his introduction. So that the practitioner needs to be aware that if they're coming up with their own patterns, that they should test them, make sure they're alive, that they're not.
And that might take a lot of time to do that.
Yeah, or just your intuition. Every project is interpreted by a different set of people, so they can come up with their own interpretations. And so it's how good you are at basically discerning if a pattern is really alive, or in fact if it's dead and not contributing aliveness. If you just use that as criteria, if you can't discern that, then good luck. Good luck with your project. So it comes down to actually making those decisions, and that's what keeps the pattern language alive. Because if the project fails, then you're not around to, I guess you could try to correct it, but there has to be this level of discernment in order for it to carry on. That's what we're trying to say.
Lovely start. Next steps. Is there a website, email contact, something you're asking people to get involved? I probably can't personally engage, but I know people who quite possibly could. But how do we connect those dots?
Right. I could just give you my email. It's an email. At the very bottom in the red, it's a red blush, or on the other ones too. It's a is it a BMTS? Oh, it's a Gmail. Okay, you can use that Gmail. There's a website as well. Yeah. So you see, my whole impetus was was to lend legitimacy to something that is essentially undisciplined. But it has so much to offer that it should really be consolidated in a form that other people can refer to. That was the whole impetus of carrying forward with this pattern language for permaculture. Yes?
Are some patterns implying that there is a best practice in most situations and circumstances? So for example, with the urban planning, you're talking about growing food right next to the restaurant. How do you make that decision versus doing indoor agriculture, year-round agriculture, something that might be more productive or could be a better use of space in high-density urban environments?
Well, that has to come through your visioning of your project. So the clearer your vision is, the better selection of the patterns within the whole language you will be able to make. And those will give you guidance as you go through and implement that project.
Right, okay, so suppose you start a design process, and would you then go through the permaculture pattern language dictionary essentially and say we want to have food production, compost, farm retail, whatever,
Yeah.
and then choose the technologies that sort of bring those patterns to life?
Yes, or just include them in the design, in the functional aspect of that design. So let's say you want local food. You have to decide what kind of local food you're going to be growing, but there will be patterns for those, as we saw in the examples. So there could be an urban microfarm. That might make a lot of sense for the project that you're working on. So that will give you guidance in terms of what a microfarm is and how it's organized and so forth, as that pattern is explained either on the website or in the publication.
Okay. I guess I'm still trying to figure out how specific a pattern has to be. Like, is food production a pattern, or is urban microfarm a pattern, or is like rotational grazing chicken tractors a pattern?
They're both
like my fried egg a pattern.
That's right. That's right. They're all patterns at different scales. So it helps to understand the general idea of growing local food, and that will be explained in sort of general terms, and why that's a problem if you don't do that, and what the solution is. And then at the end of that description, there'll be references to all the other related patterns beneath it, so that you can refer to those then. And then, and as I said, it depends how clear your vision is. If you don't have a clear vision for your project, maybe you can use the pattern language just to brainstorm. But sooner or later, you have to make those decisions.
Okay.
Right.
So some patterns may just be applicable in transition as opposed to permanent cultural sustainability.
That's a good point. And that could be.
So I'm not sure how the template would deal with.
Yeah. Well, the way to do it is to test it. Does it bring aliveness? Does it contribute to the whole? Does it raise the level of morality of a project? And if it passes, those basic criteria, you can come up with other criteria if you want. Maybe one criteria is it transitional or not? It would seem to me as though patterns can come and go. And they vary from age to age and location to location. So it would make sense to have transitional patterns. Thanks, everyone.